August 19, 1944, San Francisco Bay, California. The air felt wrong, too thin, too cool. Chio gripped the steel rail of the transport ship, the metal vibrating with the deep thrum of the engines. Her knuckles were white. Below, the water was a murky, churning gray, nothing like the impossible blue of the Pacific she remembered. A gull cried overhead, a sharp, lonely sound. Salt spray misted her face, cold and clinging. She tasted it on her lips. It tasted of nothing, not home, not anything. Her gaze drifted to the other women huddled on the deck, their faces pale and still. Their cheap cotton kimonos, now stained and rumpled from weeks at sea, fluttered in the wind, a wind that carried the scent of something industrial, something like coal smoke and damp earth. She expected the scent of menace, of hatred. Instead, she smelled bread baking. The thought was so absurd, her mind rejected it. A phantom, a memory from a life that was now over. American guards stood apart, their rifles held loosely. They did not shout, they did not shove. One of them chewed gum, a slow, rhythmic motion of his jaw. He looked bored. Chio's eyes scanned the coastline, a jagged line of buildings under a low, white sky. This was the enemy's land, the place from which the fire had come. She had been taught it was a nation of demons, of undisciplined barbarians whose only strength was in their machines. She braced herself for the cage, for the public humiliation. For the end, the ship's horn blared, a deafening, gut-shaking sound that made her flinch. The gangplank was being lowered. A man in a uniform at the bottom of the ramp gestured for them to descend. No shouting, just a wave of his hand. As she took her first step onto the dock, her wooden getter clattering on the rough planks, a woman in a strange, dark blue uniform with a white collar met her. The American woman did not look at Chio's face. She looked at her hands. Then she pressed something small, hard, and rectangular into Chio's palm. It was wrapped in paper. Chio's fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the wrapping. It was a bar of soap. It smelled faintly of lavender, clean, unused. This single, simple object made no sense. It was a detail that did not fit the narrative of her own destruction. She closed her hand around it, the sharp edges digging into her skin. The soap was real. The smell was real. The world she thought she knew was beginning to dissolve. These were not soldiers. They were the civilian remnants of a collapsing empire, swept up by the American island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Nurses from Saipan, typists from Okinawa, even entertainers and waitresses who had served the Japanese Imperial Army. Women like Fumiko, a trained nurse whose hands knew the precise tension of a bandage and the weight of a dying man's head. She had been captured in a field hospital, her uniform torn, her mind a clinical blank from exhaustion. Or Akemi, a 17-year-old clerk who had learned to type 90 words a minute on a Western keyboard, her fingers a blur of efficiency in service of a war she understood only through slogans and patriotic songs. They were part of the Gungunzoku asterisk, the civilian employees attached to the military, essential cogs in the vast, sprawling machinery of Japanese expansion. When the American Marines had overrun their garrisons, these women were faced with a choice dictated by their national code, suicide or capture. For them, the two were synonymous. Capture was not a state of being, it was a state of disgrace. It was a social death more profound than a physical one. To be taken alive was to fail one's family, one's ancestors, and one's emperor. Each woman who now stood on American soil carried this failure inside her, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. They had become non-people, ghosts. They had nothing. The clothes they wore were all they possessed. Their identity papers had been burned, their meager savings were worthless, their families presumed them dead. Their material reality was absolute zero. The risk was not merely punishment, the risk was a complete erasure of self. They were constrained by a language they could not speak, a culture they could not read, and a future that was a perfect, terrifying blank. Journey across the Pacific had been a long, disorienting purgatory. They were fed, given water, and left alone in the ship's hold. The lack of brutality was itself a form of psychological torture. It defied all their expectations, leaving their minds nothing to brace against. Now herded from the docks onto canvas-covered trucks, they traveled through a landscape of impossible order. Paved roads, identical houses with green lawns, no rubble, no sign of the war that had consumed their entire world. Fumiko watched the landscape through a slit in the canvas, her nurse's mind cataloguing, observing. The sheer material wealth was an assault. It was not just that America was undamaged, it was that America seemed to exist in another dimension, one where resources were infinite. The truck finally rumbled to a stop, the engine cutting out. The canvas flap was thrown back, and they were ordered out. Before them stood not a dungeon, but rows of simple, single-story wooden buildings surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. A camp, the end of the line. For these women, it was the physical manifestation of their disgrace, a place where their non-existence would be made official. The contrast began at the gate and extended into every facet of their new lives. It was a daily, relentless assault on their sense of reality, a comparison between the world they had been raised in and the one they now inhabited. The first comparison was sound. The Japan they knew was a place of subtle, prescribed sounds, the shuffle of tabi on tatami, the respectful murmur of conversation, the sharp crack of a superior's command. Here the dominant sounds were the rhythmic crunch of guards, boots on gravel, the metallic clang of a gate, and the constant, unintelligible murmur of English, a language that felt loose and unstructured in their ears. It was a soundscape of efficiency, not of ceremony. Then came the comparison of space. At home, space was precious, defined, and hierarchical. A woman knew her place to the inch. In the barracks, they were given a cot, a footlocker, and a prescribed volume of air. It was a geometrically equal distribution of space that felt profoundly unnatural. Akemi, the young typist, found she missed the press of bodies in a crowded Tokyo streetcar. That was a shared, understood intimacy. This was a cold, mathematical isolation, an equality that felt like being erased. There was the contrast of sustenance. The food of their memory was built on nuance, the specific saltiness of miso, the texture of perfectly cooked rice, the bitter green of a familiar vegetable. The food in the camp was a blunt instrument. White bread, soft and tasteless. Canned peaches, overpoweringly sweet. Stews made with large chunks of meat. It was abundant. Calorically, they were better fed than they had been in months, but it was an alien fuel. More than one woman in her first weeks would eat the generous portions and then retreat to her bunk to quietly weep from a hunger that had nothing to do with an empty stomach. The most jarring comparison was in the structure of authority. The Japanese military world was a vertical cliff face of rank and protocol. Every interaction was governed by one's position relative to another. Here, the American guards enforced rules, but they did it with a strange impersonality. A guard might tell a woman to move, but he would not strike her for being slow. He would issue a command, and if it was obeyed, the interaction was over. There was no lingering sense of obligation, no demand for performative deference. For Fumiko, the nurse accustomed to bowing to every doctor, this was deeply unsettling. The Americans seemed to care about compliance, not submission. It was a system of horizontal control, not vertical dominance. Over 200 Japanese female civilians were interned in camps like this one in Hunt, Idaho. For each of them, these daily contrasts chipped away at the world they had built in their minds, leaving them unmoored in a reality they could not parse. Fumiko began to count things. It was a habit from her nursing days, a way to impose order on chaos. She counted the number of blankets issued to each woman, 3, all wool, all clean. On Saipan, even in the hospital, a single threadbare blanket was a luxury. She counted the bars of soap in the washroom, the number of calories listed on the mess hall menu, the minutes allotted for their outdoor exercise. These numbers became anchors in a sea of confusion. They were facts, solid and real, when everything else felt like a dream. They measure everything, she thought one evening, lying on her cot and listening to the unfamiliar sound of crickets in the high desert. It wasn't cruelty and it wasn't kindness. It was a system. She would watch the American camp personnel, mostly women from the Women's Army Corps. They walked with a long, confident stride. They looked the male guards in the eye when they spoke. They smoked cigarettes, their gestures casual and sharp. Fumiko's mother had taught her that a woman's movements should be small, contained, like a bird's. These women moved like they owned the space around them. Akemi, the typist, focused on paper. She noticed the sheer volume of it. Forms, memos, rosters, supply requisitions. The camp ran on a river of ink and triplicate carbon copies. One day she saw a discarded memo in a trash bin. On it were their names, transliterated into Roman letters, followed by a series of numbers. She was no longer Akemi Tanaka. She was Tanaka A734. The efficiency of it was chilling, but also fascinating. She began to see the camp not as a prison, but as a complex administrative problem that the Americans were solving with paperwork. An older woman, whom the others called Setsuko-san, had been a tea-house owner. She observed the interactions. She saw a young guard no older than her own son trip and drop a stack of supplies. One of the Japanese women, acting on instinct, rushed to help him. The boy's face flushed red with embarrassment. He mumbled, "Thank you," and hurried away. Setsuko-san processed this. In her world, a soldier showing embarrassment was showing weakness. A prisoner helping a guard was a betrayal. The entire event was a violation of the proper order, yet it had happened. She noted the way the American chaplain, a tall, quiet man with pale eyes, would stand near their barracks, simply observing, never speaking unless spoken to. He did not proselytize. He did not condemn. He just was present. His presence was a question mark she could not resolve. These women were not passive victims. Their minds were constantly working, observing, analyzing, trying to decode the baffling new world they inhabited. Their interiority was a space of forensic accounting, a desperate attempt to find the underlying rules of a game they had been forced to play without their consent. The system that had brought them here was a strange hybrid of military expediency and bureaucratic legalism. When American forces captured islands like Saipan and Okinawa, they were unprepared for the sheer number of Japanese civilians who chose surrender over suicide. According to the Bushido Code animating the Japanese military, surrender was unthinkable, so there was no protocol for it. For the Americans, however, there was a protocol for everything. The women, once designated prisoners of war, were entered into a logistical pipeline governed by international law, specifically the 1929 Geneva Convention. This was the invisible architecture that shaped their existence. A woman like Akemi, seeing the paperwork, was observing the surface of a vast, submerged machine. The convention dictated minimum standards for housing, food, and medical care. It required captors to pay POWs for their labor. It allowed for correspondence and inspection by neutral parties like the International Red Cross. For the American military, adhering to the Geneva Convention was a matter of policy and principle, but also a pragmatic calculation. It was hoped that treating Japanese prisoners well might encourage more to surrender, shortening the war. This was a mechanism utterly alien to the women's understanding of conflict. To them, war was an existential struggle, not a managed process with rules. The idea that an enemy would bind itself with regulations in its treatment of a captured population was nonsensical. They could see the effects of the system, but not its logic. They saw the 3 wool blankets Fumiko counted, but couldn't comprehend the line in a treaty that mandated them. They saw the small wages they received for working in the camp laundry, around 80 cents a day, but couldn't grasp the legal framework that turned their prison labor into a paid transaction. This system extended across the ocean. A vast network of ships, trains, and administrative hubs was mobilized to move and manage them. They were cogs in a machine they never knew existed. The schematic metaphor that might have formed in Fumiko's analytical mind was that of a hospital. In a hospital, a person ceases to be an individual and becomes a patient, a collection of symptoms and chart numbers. Their personal story is irrelevant to the treatment protocol. In the same way, they had ceased to be Japanese women and had become POWs, a category to be processed, housed, and managed according to a pre-written impersonal script. The script was the Geneva Convention. The camp was the ward, and the war itself was a distant, abstract disease. Their captors were not acting out of malice or mercy. They were simply following the protocol. This realization, dawning slowly, was more disorienting than any act of cruelty could have been. The contrasts of daily life inside the wire were one thing, but then the system introduced a new, even more radical juxtaposition. After several months in the camp, a notice was posted. A church group from the nearby town of Twin Falls had requested permission to host some of the prisoners for a Sunday service and a luncheon. The camp commander, adhering to regulations that encouraged intellectual and recreational pursuits, approved it. Participation was voluntary. For most of the women, the idea was terrifying. To leave the relative predictability of the camp, to go into an American town, to be among the enemy civilians, it was unthinkable. But for a small group, including Chiyo and Akemi, curiosity outweighed fear. The unknown was frightening, but their current reality was so profoundly strange that this new strangeness seemed only a matter of degree. The secondary contrast was immediate. One moment they were inside the camp, a world of dust, wood, and wire, a monochrome existence defined by straight lines and right angles. The next, they were riding in a bus through a town of painted houses, green lawns, and strange, boxy automobiles. The destination was a brick building with a tall, pointed steeple and colored glass windows. Inside, the contrast sharpened. The air was cool and smelled of wax and old paper. Polished wooden pews gleamed under the soft light filtering through the stained glass. An organ played a low, resonant melody that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The sounds of the camp, the gravel, the gates, the barked orders, were gone, replaced by a deep, shared quiet. They were led to a row near the front. American townspeople filed in, men in dark suits, women in dresses and hats. They smiled at the Japanese women, not a wide, false smile, but a small, hesitant gesture of welcome. Akemi clutched the hymn book she was given. The paper was smooth and thin, the English text an incomprehensible series of marks. But then the music started, and the congregation began to sing. The language was alien, but the melody was simple, beautiful. It was a human sound, a sound of community. After the service, they were led to a hall downstairs. Tables were laden with food, fried chicken, potato salad, cakes with thick frosting. A woman with kind, wrinkled eyes and gray hair piled high on her head approached Chiyo. She held out a plate with a piece of cake. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft. Chiyo understood the one word. She looked at the woman's face, searching for the trick, the angle. There was none. She looked at the plate. A single, perfect strawberry sat on the white frosting. The camp provided sustenance. This was an offering. The difference was absolute. This experience created a profound ideological friction. The women's entire worldview was built on a foundation of Japanese exceptionalism and the purity of the Yamato race. They had been taught that foreigners, especially Americans, were crude, materialistic, and spiritually empty. They were the enemy, a monolithic block of shared hatred. Surrender was the ultimate pollution of one's Japanese spirit, a stain that could never be removed. They were, in their own minds, untouchable, disgraced. And yet here they were in a sacred space of the enemy, being treated not just with humanity, but with a kind of gentle honor. They were guests. This inversion of roles was a cognitive earthquake. Chiyo, accepting the piece of cake, felt a tremor run through her. Her hand shook as she took the plate. Her training, her culture, her entire sense of self screamed that this was wrong. It was a deception, a psychological trick to break them down. Or worse, it was an act of pity, a confirmation of their pathetic, fallen state. But the old woman's eyes held no pity. They held a simple, open-faced sincerity. This was the clash, the Japanese ideal of a society built on situational ethics, where your identity and treatment depend entirely on your relationship to the group, versus the Christian ideal presented to them that day of a universal grace that extends even to one's enemies. In the barracks that night, the few who had gone sat in silence, processing the impossible. Akemi kept thinking about the children she had seen, little American girls with blonde hair who had stared at her with open, uncomplicated curiosity, not hatred. "They do not hate us," she whispered to Fumiko in the dark. Fumiko, the ever-practical nurse, did not answer immediately. She was thinking about the hands of the women who had served the food. They were hands softened by lotion, their nails clean and shaped. They were not the hands of war. How could a people who fought with such terrifying, overwhelming force possess such gentleness at their core? The question hung in the air between them. The event violated every assumption they held about their enemy and themselves. It suggested that their disgrace, so absolute in their own minds, was not recognized here. It was as if they had crossed a border and their currency of shame was no longer valid. This was more terrifying than any punishment. It meant their map of the world was wrong. The machinery of the camp, however, was not built on grace, but on meticulous record-keeping. The evidence of the women's strange new reality was everywhere, logged in the dry, factual language of bureaucracy. Camp Hunt, officially known as the Minadoka Relocation Center, but repurposed to hold specific POW populations, was run according to U.S. Army Regulation 3455. This document, filtered through camp memoranda, dictated the minutiae of their lives. Miko, with her sharp eyes, would have noticed the patterns, the data points that confirmed the system's bizarre logic. Records show that the diet for Japanese prisoners was mandated to be a minimum of 3,000 calories per day, equivalent to that of an American soldier in a non-combat role. The contents of this diet were specified: ounces of meat, bread, vegetables, and even coffee. This wasn't a chef's choice, it was a quartermaster's calculation. The work program was similarly documented. The women who worked in the laundry, the kitchens, or the infirmary had their hours logged. Their pay, typically 10 cents per hour for unskilled labor, was recorded in ledgers. They could use these earnings at the camp canteen to buy small luxuries like candy, magazines, or sewing kits. Akemi might have glimpsed these ledgers, seeing her own name next to a growing credit. The idea of being paid by her captors for her labor was a concept so foreign it bordered on the surreal. The mail system was another source of concrete evidence. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were allowed to send and receive mail. Letters were heavily censored, of course, every character scrutinized. But the system existed. A woman could, in theory, write a letter to the International Red Cross in Geneva, and the U.S. Army was obligated to transmit it. The existence of this channel, this theoretical appeal to a higher, neutral authority, implied a world order beyond the simple binary of victor and vanquished. The church visits themselves were part of a recorded pattern. The camp's administrative files would have contained the formal request from the Twin Falls Ministerial Association, the commander's letter of approval, and a list of the prisoners who attended. It wasn't a spontaneous act of kindness. It was a sanctioned, scheduled event, an approved interaction between two carefully defined groups. For the women, these pieces of evidence, observed in fragments, slowly assembled into a portrait of their captors. They were not lawless barbarians. They were a people obsessed with rules. The fence, the guards, the regulations, it was all one system. The church visit, the pay, the food, that was part of the system too. It was this consistency, this dispassionate application of a single, overarching code, that was so profoundly and terribly new. The cumulative effect of this cognitive dissonance began to exact a physical and psychological toll. The emotional crescendo was not a single loud event, but a quiet internal implosion. Back in the barracks, the fragile solidarity of shared suffering began to fray. The women who had gone to the church were now different. They carried a secret, an experience the others could not comprehend. Suspicion grew. Were they collaborators? Were they being brainwashed? The non-attenders clung to their familiar worldview, reinforcing their hatred of the Americans as a defense mechanism. For them, it was easier to believe their comrades were weak than to believe their entire nation was wrong. For Chio, the conflict manifested as a tightness in her chest. She had trouble sleeping. During the day, she would find her hands clenching into fists for no reason. The simple memory of the old woman's smile could make her feel a wave of nausea. The kindness felt like a poison, dissolving her identity from the inside out. Her sense of duty, of purpose, of who she was, it was all predicated on a clear enemy. If the enemy was not who she thought they were, then who was she? The question was a precipice, and she was terrified of the fall. Acme became withdrawn. She spent hours staring at the patterns of the wood grain on the barracks wall. The neat lines of the English in the hymn book, the ordered columns in the ledgers she imagined, it was a world of logic, of systems. But the feelings it produced in her were chaotic, terrifying. She felt a profound sense of shame, but it was a new kind of shame. Not the shame of surrender, but the shame of her own ignorance. The shame of realizing the world was so much larger and more complicated than she had ever been taught. One night, Fumiko was awakened by a muffled sound. In the bunk across from her, one of the younger women who had gone to the church was crying. Not a loud theatrical wail, but a deep, silent, shoulder-shaking sob. It was the sound of a soul breaking, or perhaps the sound of a soul being broken open. Fumiko lay still, her own heart aching with a feeling she couldn't name. It was empathy, but it was also fear. She understood that the polite smiles and plates of cake were more dangerous than any weapon. A bayonet could kill you. A kind word could kill your world. The revelation, when it came, was not grand or sudden. It arrived in a quiet moment of observation. Fumiko was in the camp infirmary, helping one of the American nurses, a stern, efficient woman named Corporal Evans. A Japanese prisoner, a woman suffering from severe dehydration, was brought in. Corporal Evans began treatment immediately. She spoke to the sick woman in short, simple English commands, her voice devoid of any emotion, no pity, no contempt. Her hands were quick, competent. She checked the woman's pulse, administered an IV drip, and recorded the details on a chart. She performed the exact same series of actions Fumiko had seen her perform on an American guard who had fainted from the heat a week earlier. The protocol was identical. In that moment, watching the clear fluid drip from the bag down the tube and into the arm of her fellow prisoner, Fumiko understood. It was not about kindness. It was not about cruelty. It was not about them at all. The entire system, the food, the regulations, the church visits, the medical care, was not a message directed at the Japanese prisoners personally. It was an expression of the Americans' beliefs about themselves. Their rules applied to everyone because, in their worldview, everyone was subject to the same fundamental set of principles. The system was the message. This single, crystallizing thought reinterpreted everything. The church invitation was not an attempt to convert them. It was what those people did because their code said to welcome the stranger. The 3 blankets were not a strategic indulgence. It was what the supply manual dictated for a human being in that climate. Corporal Evans's dispassionate care was not a sign of coldness. It was the application of a medical code that superseded nationality. The immediate implication was that the Americans were not hypocrites. They were, in fact, terrifyingly consistent. The same impersonal, systematic logic that provided medical care and approved church visits was the same logic that directed the firebombing of their cities. It was all part of the same machine, the same rule set applied on different scales. The second implication was even more profound. If the Americans were acting according to their own internal code, then the Japanese, too, had been acting according to theirs. And the 2 codes had produced these wildly different results. One, a nation of plenty and process, the other, a nation of ritual, sacrifice, and ashes. The revelation was not a happy one. It offered no comfort, only a stark, dispassionate clarity. Their world had not been destroyed by demons. It had been defeated by a more effective system. This insight allows us to connect the human-scale moments to the system-scale meaning. Chio's bar of lavender soap was not just a piece of hygiene. It was the smallest possible output of an industrial and logistical system of staggering scale. A system that could fight a global war and still have surplus capacity for scented soap. The cause was mass production. The effect was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance for a single prisoner. Acme's fascination with paperwork points to the same conclusion. The American war effort was built not just on steel and explosives, but on bureaucracy. This bureaucracy, with its forms and regulations, tended to create a baseline of standardized, impersonal treatment. It was a system that, by its nature, resisted the kind of arbitrary, personal cruelty the women had expected. The effect was that their survival was not dependent on the momentary whim of a guard, but on the durable, repeatable logic of the system itself. The church visit serves as a perfect microcosm of this synthesis. It was an expression of American civil society, a sphere of voluntary association that operated in parallel to the government. The Women's Code had no equivalent for this. In Imperial Japan, all associations were ultimately subordinate to the state. The existence of a group that could interface with the military prison system, not as superiors or inferiors, but as independent actors, was a demonstration of a different model of social organization. What these experiences reveal is that the women were not just prisoners of war. They were unwilling anthropologists, encountering a civilization whose core principles were fundamentally different from their own. The system they were intended to value universal rules over situational relationships. It tended to prioritize process over personal honor. This is not to claim the American system was perfect or without its own brutal hypocrisies. The existence of Japanese-American internment camps elsewhere is a stark reminder of that. But for these specific women, in this specific context, the system they encountered behaved in a way that relentlessly, systematically, and impersonally contradicted their deepest-held beliefs about the world. Their journey was not one of being convinced of American superiority, but of being forced to acknowledge the sheer power of a competing ideology, made manifest in everything from a hymn book to a supply ledger. The memory that lingered for Chio years later was not the fear or the hunger or even the grand shock of the church. It was the weight of the soap in her hand, the solid, real, inexplicable fact of it. It was the first piece of evidence that her map of the world was wrong, a map that had been drawn for her in the clear, sharp lines of duty and sacrifice. She and the other women were eventually repatriated to a Japan they no longer recognized, a country shattered and occupied, forced to draw a new map for itself. They carried their impossible experiences with them, a quiet knowledge that the world was not a simple story of heroes and demons. Their captors had shown them a different way of being, not through lectures or propaganda, but through the silent, overwhelming evidence of their systems. The questions these women were forced to confront still echo today. What happens when our understanding of an enemy collides with an undeniable act of their humanity? How do we process evidence that contradicts the very foundations of our own identity. If this account unsettles your own assumptions, that is its purpose. Notice what changes when you look not for individual heroes or villains, but for the systems that shape their actions. We will continue to explore these friction points of history in our next episode. Subscribe to keep questioning with us.